Happy New Year everyone, I hope you're all well. I am now back. Apologies, I did say I was going to come back last time, but I just sort of needed to work through a few things. If you're new here, then welcome to my little family, and if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for sticking around whilst I've been a bit AWOL. The reason I've not sort of come on the camera is because I needed time myself to sort of process everything that had happened last year. Obviously Margot's hospital adventure was a very long one, and you know, there was some life-threatening things that did happen. I've not really spoken much about it since, just because, again, I just needed to process everything and let it settle within myself. We are into a new year. I've had loads of people asking me, I keep getting a few comments here and there asking me about the update and how she's doing, what happened, and then I get DMs every now and then saying some people are going through the same thing, and it just made me remember why I started doing this little journey. It's because when I was looking for information, when I had Margot's, when I had Margot's almost diagnosis, I couldn't find what I wanted to find, and so it just gave me that little jerk to just get on with it and talk about it all. Not only is it going to help you guys, but it will probably help myself as well, because as I said, I've not really sat down and just spoken about everything that happened. Sorry if you can hear my son upstairs, he's watching his iPad. I'm just going to start right from the beginning. Margot was born on the 1st of March. She was a very healthy sized baby considering she was 3 weeks early. She was £7.1. I was really worried when she was first initially born because she wasn't crying. I couldn't hear any sound. I was obviously on I was just very exhausted. I was on different drugs because I had a hemorrhage again, and so I didn't really know what was going on. All I could remember is that she wasn't crying. They reassured me she was fine, she was breathing and everything was fine, and when they handed me to her, I remember my first thought being, okay, she does have Down syndrome. And when I think back to that now, that's so sad. I wish that my first thought would have just been, she's here, because that was still going on in the back of my mind, but my first thought, and I've got a picture, I did post it on my Instagram, a picture of me just looking down at her, and you can just see this confusion in my face as I was trying to work out whether she did or not have Down syndrome, because we obviously didn't get the 100% diagnosis, we just got the 95%, and when you don't have the 100% diagnosis, not that we didn't assume she would have it, because we took from that we assumed she would, but you have so many people saying, well, I knew someone that had that and their baby didn't have Down syndrome. I knew someone that had a 95% accuracy that they were going to have Down syndrome and they didn't have Down syndrome, and it just makes you rethink all of everything you've decided in your mind. And so I was just thinking, oh, maybe she doesn't have Down syndrome, but when she was born you could tell, just from her face, her different characteristics in her face, you could see. After all of that happened, we went into the labour ward. I was given a separate room on the side, purely because they knew that they'd have paediatrics coming in to do loads of tests for Margot for different things, and they didn't want to disturb all the other babies in case something happened to happen in the middle of the night, which I completely understood. However, we weren't in the labour ward very long. We had the paediatrics came down to see her. It was, I think it was the same day, around 3:30. So she was born just before 6:30 in the morning. I'd obviously slept, but I was still like all loopy from all the drugs they'd given me whilst I was hemorrhaging, and they just looked at her. She was purple. So the entire time from when she was born to this time, she was really purple. She didn't really wake up, she didn't feed, she didn't cry, she didn't fuss. She just slept the entire time. There's me thinking, oh my god, I've got a really easy baby, but actually that wasn't the case. So I had loads of scans during my pregnancy that were like intricate specialist scans to check her heart, and nothing was found. Well, before they'd even taken her upstairs, they just looked at her and they said, she doesn't look right, and we're going to take her upstairs. are you coming with us? They initially said, oh, we'll only probably be like 15 minutes, but I, being a new mum again, I just wanted to be with my baby, so I went up with them. And I'm so thankful I did, because there's me a bit out of it because I'm still loopy. They're putting her on, I think it's called a giraffe bed, and they're doing all these different tests. About 6 different doctors come in because her oxygen levels were so low. She was so which is why she was so purple. She was also really jaundiced, but to the point that she was so jaundiced that she went a red colour rather than a yellow colour. And I didn't really know what's going on. I had one of the doctors come over to me and try and explain it, but obviously I'm just a bit all over the place, and they just basically said she's going to be staying up here. So from the 5-day stay that they initially told me I would have before I gave birth, turned into we don't know what's going to happen. This obviously was really scary, but once they had settled her and gotten her all chewed up, because she had oxygen, she had oxygen and she had a feeding tube as well, and then she was put under the UV light. The heart doctor, the cardiologist, then came round and did a scan of her heart. I'm not entirely sure what they found that day because I just was so out of it. They tried to explain it to me and I just didn't understand, and so I just sort of agreed and nodded along, because even if I wasn't like still on all the drugs, I don't think I would have understood. But the fact that I was, I just couldn't take any more information. The information I had was that she was staying in hospital in the paediatrics, in neonatal, and I couldn't do anything about it. They then, yeah, when they did her scan, all I remember them telling me basically is that she wouldn't need any extra support once she was off the oxygen. They just thought that she would have to just grow a bit bigger to get her oxygen up, and they'd keep doing a scan every week or so just to check, because there's something, they said she had a tiny little hole in her heart, but that's normal for newborns. Most newborns has reconnected before they're born. Because she was slightly early, they said it's not unnormal for the heart to be not completely closed. And so I was quite happy with that information, just sort of thought, okay, that's fine. Come a week later, she's still not getting any better, still won't take any bottles, won't breastfeed. She was still like the day she was born. They had hoped she would make some progress, but if anything she was regressing. She was getting really poorly from nowhere, and they weren't entirely sure how, because obviously everyone that was in the hospital had masks on, and it was very cleanly, like really clean area. And she kept having to be isolated because they didn't want to make other babies ill, because they thought it was like a cold, but they were unsure of where a cold would have come from, because, you know, you're in this completely sanitized area. They then did another scan, and the hole was bigger than they initially thought, but they still thought it would close on its own. But she was still getting worse. They would slowly wean her off the oxygen and she'd be doing really well, and then all of a sudden she would completely regress. I'd get a call in like 11 o'clock at night saying we've had to put her back on oxygen, just so you're aware that you don't come in tomorrow, and she's all like oxygened up again. So that happened like 2 or 3 times, I would say. Then it got to week 3 and she went into heart failure. They did another scan and decided that the hole had gotten even bigger and she would need open heart surgery sooner rather than later. However, the hospital we were at couldn't do any more for her than they already had. They were quite limited on anything extra they could do because of the type of hospital it is. And so they had called over to Southampton and asked when they had availability for us to go in, and they were quite keen to get us there really quickly, and we were there within the week. I think it was like a few days later. When we got there, the doctor we saw and the nurses that were there, all the nurses were incredible. There was none that, you know, we were like, oh my god, I don't want her. But when we got to Southampton, it was like they knew us for the whole time. It was really reassuring. I can't remember the doctor's name, but one of the doctors came round and he just said, like, what amount of oxygen is she on? Which the nurse responded. He said, try and wean her down. If she's not off within 2 days, then she's getting a heart operation this week. Which was scary, obviously very scary to hear. the 2 days came around and she was on more oxygen because she just wasn't coping. And that same doctor came around and just said, well, that's our answer. She's not leaving this hospital until she has her operation. So she was like not even 4 weeks old and was booked in to have her operation. The first one got cancelled because an emergency came in, and we were set to go the next day. There's all these different questions, and filling out that form, you have to sign a form basically that allows them to do the operation, and it's just like the most heartbreaking form because you're basically you're signing to say, I understand that my child might die. However, in Margot's case, had she not had the operation, she was going to die. The anaesthetist was doing the thing. They let me stay with her, like hold her hand while she was having it done, which was just awful in itself. They actually had to give her a double dose because she wouldn't take to it. They said that's quite common with babies with Down syndrome, which I thought was quite funny. And then we went to IKEA to try and take our minds off of it because it is a big thing and sitting around waiting is not going to help. So we went to IKEA and walked around just constantly waiting for that call to tell us that it was over, because even when they give you the call to tell you that it's fine, everything's done, and she's in the ICU, you can't go straight away to see them. You have to wait then a few hours whilst they get them all ready and hooked up to all the machines, but at least you know they're okay. So when we were allowed, we went down to see her in the ICU, and I will insert a picture in a moment. So if you don't like seeing babies with tubes and wounds, don't look, and just hide your eyes for a minute, but I'll show you the picture. It was heartbreaking to see that. But again, the nurses in there were absolutely lovely. They did a little diary of when Margot was in the hospital, in the ICU. They did little diaries every day. Just because the ICU is such a different environment, you can't pick them up, you can't be a parent to that baby at that time because they're hooked up on God knows what drugs, because they're obviously in pain from the surgery, then also on a sedation because they need them to be asleep so they can heal from the surgery, and then they're also on antibiotics to make sure they don't get any infections. It's crazy. It's an absolutely crazy place. But we were there, I think she was there for 3 days, and then she went back up to the normal ward on the high dependency unit. After a baby's had a open heart surgery, they are placed with like external pacing wires attached to their heart, which can just be pulled out if they're unneeded. Margot unfortunately did need to use hers. Her heart just was not keeping up, so they paced her with an external pacer, hoping that it'd just be one of those things that would rework itself. However, it didn't. They did try and take the pacer off, but she just couldn't cope. Her heart rate, which was like gut-wrenching to see on the screen, her heart rate was just dropping and dropping and dropping. They obviously then turned it back on before it would drop any lower because it just got too slow, and she was then diagnosed with complete heart block. She was then booked in for another surgery to have a pacemaker fitted. She was given 2 weeks for her heart to try and rework itself. Unfortunately it didn't, and so that's when they decided to book her in. The heart operation that she did have, actually, for any of you who know anything about hearts or anything like that, she had a complete AVSD. It was a really big one. They said it was like the size of a penny, which obviously for her heart was absolutely huge. And then she also had a PDA ligation, which is something to do with one of the funnels doing the blood. I'm not entirely sure, it's all a bit confusing. But that's why they possibly think that she needed the pacemaker, because the hole was so big that the electrolytes or something, whatever it is, don't connect anymore. They said there is a chance still that it can come back later in life, but the chance is like 5% and lower. She's now got a pacemaker. She was obviously need that changed every however many years. But for now, it's really clever. We have a little device at home that is plugged in next to her bed, and we literally scan it over there. It's like a little mouse, and you scan it over the pacemaker and it downloads all of the information and sends it over to the hospital, and that is done every 6 months. And then once a year she's also given an in-person appointment. So the day of the pacemaker comes, it's fitted and everything went really smoothly. She was then able to go home, I think less than a week later, which was really exciting. We were so excited to just get her home. She hadn't met anyone, she hadn't even met her brother because it was really limited. You were only allowed parents in the wards because obviously COVID, and it just been so difficult. My mum actually had met her because my mum had come in with me when I got my induction. She was allowed to come in and see me again on the first day with visiting hours. After she'd had her pacemaker, she was nearly 8 weeks old by the time we finally got her home, and we were so excited. I will try and insert the clip of Theo meeting her because it is the cutest thing.
You give Bubba a kiss. Mwah.
She was then home for about 3.5 weeks before something wasn't right. She was not breathing quite right. She was so pale and she just wasn't herself. She was sleeping all the time, and I mean, for newborn babies that's quite normal, but she was sleeping more than usual. She was hardly ever awake. Because her work of breathing was much more under the ribs, I was a bit concerned. I took her in because we have open access at the hospital she was born at. They thought she just had a really severe case of bronchiolitis, so they kept her in the, again, high dependency ward unit room at our hospital, and it was just, something wasn't right. She just wasn't responding to anything they were giving her. Her infection markers when they did her blood tests were sky high. So normally when they go to hospital, they like them to be no higher than 50. If they're around that mark, they will keep them in because something is wrong. Margot's were over 200, like nearly at the 300 mark, and so something wasn't right. And then all of a sudden, out of absolutely nowhere, her SATs, which is like shows her oxygen levels, her heart rate, and her pulse. So her pacemaker is set at 110 beats per minute. All of a sudden, her oxygen levels go from 100% down to in the 60s. Her heart rate goes from 100, like between 110 and 120, like through the roof, over 200 beats per minute. She went limp and floppy and just completely white. No one knew what had happened. So straight off the bat, the nurse kept, again, I'm not joking, 20 maybe nurses and doctors came into that room. So all of a sudden, like, the emergency button was pushed because they didn't know what it was. She was just, nothing was looking good. They came over to me and they just said, we're going to intubate. They called Southampton and just said, you need to come and get her now. This is an emergency patient and she needs a bed in your PICU as soon as you get her to Southampton. We were obviously rushed there. We got there and again, something just wasn't right. And I thought it was something to do with her pacemaker because I said, it's red around the pacemaker. It just doesn't look right. Can you just check it out? And so the next day they did, and so I'd been there for the morning and they didn't think the doctors would come until like later in the afternoon. I lived 2 hours away from Southampton, but I'd obviously gone there with no childcare in place. Luckily my mum was on call. I had no childcare in place, I had no clothes, and I had no toothbrush or anything. So I just said, they gave me a toothbrush thankfully, and toothpaste. But I just said, I'm gonna go home and I'll be back literally within 4 hours because I just need to pack a bag so I've got stuff to stay because it looks like it's gonna be at least a couple of days. My mum was amazing looking after Theo. As I'm on my way back to my house, I was already like over halfway, I get a call from the doctors saying her pacemaker has a lot of pus in it and we're going to take her to theatre now. Are you able to come and sign the form? I said, I can, but I'm like an hour and a half away. can you give consent over the phone? I said I'm happy to give consent over the phone. If that needs to be done, that needs to be done. So I then had another doctor call and just confirm my consent, because they obviously have to have 2 people just to make sure on their end, which I completely understood. So there I am, like rushing to get everything done so I can get back as quick as I can. When I did get back, she wasn't quite out of theatre yet, but I think she was like half an hour. She then did come out of theatre, and I was just speaking to the nurse, and she had 10 mils of pus around her pacemaker. Obviously for someone who's an adult, that's not a huge amount, but for a little baby, bearing in mind she was on the small side because she'd lost so much weight from where she wasn't eating when she was born. Yeah, just had 10 mils of pus all around her pacemaker, and they determined that it was sepsis. Thankfully, I took her into the hospital when I did, otherwise I'm not sure where she'd be right now. Then put her on tons of different antibiotics to help her. They then had her for maybe, I don't know, maybe a week, and she still wasn't getting better. She was getting worse. Also was like getting colds again, and they just couldn't figure it out. She was still sedated, so at this point I couldn't even pick her up, I couldn't hold her, I could literally touch her hand. She was constantly asleep, because if she'd woken up, she's intubated, and babies can't wake up when they're intubated because they will damage their lungs. They said, we need to take her back to theatre, we're going to change the pacing box and see if that helps, because we don't believe the sepsis is gone. They explained to me everything they were going to do. They were going to wash out the area where the pacemaker goes with the specific antibiotic that reacts to this sepsis, change it to a new pacing box so it's completely fresh, completely clean, and then close it back up again. If that weren't to work, they said they would try and change the wires, and then they said if the wires didn't work, then they didn't have another choice. So at that point it was really scary, and I was just praying and hoping with everything in me that this would work and she wouldn't have to go through another surgery. This surgery didn't take a huge amount of time, but when you're in that situation it feels like forever. She came out, and thank goodness it worked. I'm not entirely sure what I would have done had that not worked. I think she was in the ICU for another week after that before going up to the normal ward, and obviously they just had her on watch all the time. I think we stayed in hospital for about a week again after that, so she was in hospital roughly around 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks before she did come home again, and thankfully it had gone. She is absolutely fine now. She is thriving and living her best life. She is doing so well. I do post quite a lot on TikTok, so if you have family via YouTube and you want to catch up on any like real-time videos, I do have quite a lot on TikTok, because at the time I knew I'd want to look back at some point and just not relive, but look at how strong she is, and just see everything. And so I did document quite a lot of it on there, and yeah, so if you want to see that, it's all on there. My TikTok is just at @byfayeaster. I will link it down below if I can. But that is her hospital story. She's been in hospital a few times since then, but for less major things. We've not had any awful things since then. She's got heart checkups next week, and also in February for her pacemaker, and I'm just so thankful to be at the other end of this story now. It was such a tough few months, and at some points I didn't know if she was going to make it. At the same time, you also have people telling you how strong you are and how amazingly you're doing, and inside all you wanted to do is just curl up in a ball and ignore the world, but you have no other choice. Carrying on going is your only choice. So I'm so thankful to the hospital we have and how amazing they are with her, and Southampton Hospital, and obviously all my friends and family, because I think I would have crumbled without them. Theo had been amazing through it all, considering he was so used to being there all the time, and then all of a sudden Mummy was just gone. So I'm just, yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be in a new year, continuing on Margot's development. She's doing really well, and yeah, I'm excited to get my channel up and going again. If you want to leave any questions down below, or if you don't want people to see your question, I have my DMs open on Instagram. I will also link that down below, so please feel free to message me. I don't want anyone to not be able to find the information they want. I hope you all had a lovely new year and celebrated in the best way you could. If you haven't already, I would love for you to subscribe, give it a little like and a little comment down below, and I will see you all next week. Bye!